this will be one of our more compelling colleagues and conversations. A couple of, or really one major housekeeping thing, and that is, other than keeping your microphones off when you can, also, if you have questions, and Dr. Kudler has asked for us to have as much of a dialogue with him as possible. So if you have questions, or when you have questions or comments, please post them to the chat through the chat function. You can chat to everyone, and I will monitor those and ask them as we go along. And then at the end of the Dr. Kudler's talk, then we can have a more open dialogue once that goes. I want to give you a heads up on coming attractions. So I'm going to be a little bit longer in introduction than I usually am, because there's a lot to say, in particular in introducing Dr. Kudler. But we have a very nice lineup for the next 6 months or so. So in March 26th, we're going to have Dr. Jordy Kleiner from the North Shore Learning Clinic talking about neurodivergent patients. Dr. Kleiner is one of our main consultants when we have a patient for whom we think there's some cognitive struggles, or looking for strategies to help them manage some cognitive blocks. And so I think you'll find Dr. Kleiner really compelling. He's really great. And then in April 16th, we'll have Linda Michaels, who is the president of, or co-chair of, the Psychotherapy Action Network, which is a psychoanalytic group that tracks really how as a culture and how as a profession we track psychodynamic and psychoanalytic treatment to the public. And Linda will talk about what patients seek from psychotherapy. They have some really fascinating data pre and post COVID, interestingly, about what patients are looking for in psychotherapy. And May 21st, Jeffrey Roth will be talking to us about psychoanalytics group psychotherapy. On June 17th, Art Nielsen will talk about his new book and talk about integrative couples therapy. In July, we'll have Dr. Robert Gallitzer-Levy, who's a local well-known analyst, talking about systemic racism and how that enters the consulting room. And then in August, Jonathan Lear, and we don't quite have a topic on that one yet. So I'm going into the year with some really strong talks, and I hope you can join us as much as you can. Okay, I'd like to introduce you, Dr. Kudler. I think we're in for a treat tonight. I've had the pleasure of being able to talk with him a little bit as we're leading into this thing, and I find he's incredibly thoughtful and incredibly fascinating in how he puts together an understanding of trauma. So Dr. Kudler received his medical degree from SUNY downstate, and he trained in psychiatry at Yale and is adjunct professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at Duke University. In 2003, Dr. Kudler was awarded the Edith Sapshin Award from the American Psychoanalytic Association for excellence in teaching. His expertise in post-traumatic stress disorder stems from clinical and research work with combat veterans, ex-prisoners of war, survivors of other traumatic events, and their families. He has reported on many aspects of PTSD, including its diagnosis, its biological and psychological characteristics, and its treatment. Dr. Kudler was the founding chair of the PTSD Practice Guidelines Task Force of the International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies, and he was the first author of that task force's treatment guideline for psychodynamic treatment of PTSD. Dr. Kudler reported to Congress as co-chair of the VA's Special Committee on PTSD. He has served on the International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies Board of Directors. He's co-led development of joint VA and Department of Defense guidelines for post-traumatic stress, and he's advised Sesame Street's Talk, Listen, Connect series for military families. He co-founded the VA's Mid-Atlantic Mental Illness Research, Education, and Clinical Center on Deployment, Mental Health, and the North Carolina Governor's Work Group on Service Members, Veterans, and their families. And he was appointed to the North Carolina Institute of Medicine in 2014. He joined the VA Central Office as Chief Consultant for Mental Health and served as acting assistant deputy undersecretary for patient care until he retired from that post in 2018. Dr. Kudler is currently working to integrate mental and public health efforts on behalf of service members, veterans, and their families. He also provides consultation in clinical and administrative settings and is developing an integrated set of writing projects designed to advance the mental health and wellness of service members, veterans, their families, and communities.
Okay, did you do it?
And he's thought a lot and will share with us a lot about how to understand PTSD and how our understanding has evolved. So with that, Dr. Kudler, I'll turn it over to you.
Oh, thanks so much, Michael. And it's really a pleasure to get to kick off such a remarkable set of speakers you're going to have this year. I'm going to have to tune in for more of these. I also see a lot of old friends and colleagues and a few relatives, all professionals, mind you, on the call. So that's a special pleasure too. And again, my understanding, I'll say this for everybody's sake, is that, you know, this Colleagues and Conversations series is really meant to be a conversation. Now, I've prepared lots of stuff to talk about, and I've been told that I could talk for an hour or even longer, and that would be fine. But I've gotten to a point where it's perfectly okay with me if I never get to all 9 pages of my notes. And if people have questions or want to open conversations or follow a thread in this discussion, I'd be really interested in doing that, because I think, after all, we're supposed to be having a collegial conversation, and we might get to other points better than the ones that I had written down here. So, but let me kick it off and see where this takes all of us. Yeah, I'll start with this. So, in the book, The Discovery of the Unconscious, Andre Ellenberger identified Franz Anton Mesmer's late 18th century application of animal magnetism. Remember the theory of animal magnetism, that magnetism perfused everything, including human beings, and that one could use animal magnetism to relieve physical and mental illnesses by realigning what were now distorted magnetic processes in people's bodies. That would work for physical illness and mental illness. And Ellenberger says this was actually the beginning of medical psychotherapy. Even though I think if Mesmer came back from the dead, he would be very unhappy with that description. Because Mesmer's theory of treatment didn't actually focus on psychological trauma, but rather on this imbalance of magnetic forces. Mesmerism was highly effective in patients who were often beyond the power of 18th century medicine. And there was such a huge demand for his services that he had to create new ways of treating lots of people at once. One such method was having a number of patients sit in a specially constructed bathing tank that was crosshatched with metal pipes, which were understood to be radiating magnetic lines of force through the water and into the bodies of the patients, thus realigning their magnetic fields and reestablishing health. Mesmer's insistence that his cures were purely magnetic ultimately led to his fall from grace. Once a scientific commission led by Benjamin Franklin, who was in France as an ambassador from the American colonies and was acknowledged as a world expert on magnetism and electricity, proved through a series of experiments that there really was no magnetism in mesmerism. Dr. Mesmer was discredited, and the practice of mesmerism was abandoned, at least in France. It came back later as hypnosis in England. But of special interest to us as clinicians, the Franklin Commission really wasn't focused on whether or not Mesmer did make people better, because he did make people better. And there were hundreds of medical articles about this in his time. You might say that in dismissing his work, because they simply disproved its underlying hypothesis about magnetism, that they threw out the baby with the magnetized bathwater. Mesmerism was then suppressed in clinical practice till it reemerged as hypnosis in the 19th century and played a prominent role in the work of the great neurologist Jean-Martin Charcot. Charcot, however, believed that hypnosis was a purely physiological phenomenon rather than a psychological one. I think Freud pretty much said that Charcot didn't have a psychological bone in his body. Uh, but Charcot's biological bent didn't prevent two of his students, Sigmund Freud and Pierre Janet, from developing their respective theories about how traumatic experiences laid the groundwork for hysterical symptoms. These were symptoms that Charcot treated with hypnosis. By the way, Charcot couldn't completely get rid of these symptoms the way that Mesmer could, but he could change them during his demonstrations in kind of miraculous ways. Charcot himself resigned in disgrace when it was proven to his own satisfaction that the hypnotic phenomena that he had always ascribed to neurobiology were in fact the products of psychological suggestion. He quit his job, he left. Although I ran across a story in a biography of Charcot that said that just a few days before he died, he had an inspiration. He told his secretary that he had had an inspiration that was going to, as he put it, dynamite the theory of hypnosis at its foundation. But he died within a few days without ever telling anybody what that revelation was. So we're left to wonder. There's probably a movie in that. Breuer and Freud's radical notion underpinning their 1895 studies on hysteria was that people with hysteria suffered mainly from reminiscences, and these were specifically reminiscences, memories of traumatic events. Yet even those co-authors differed fundamentally in how they understood the pathology of trauma. Breuer was much closer to Charcot in believing that hysterical symptoms developed because the patient biologically could not process traumatic experiences. They would fall into perception during what Breuer considered to be a hypnoid state, a kind of self-induced trance state, an altered state. And that things learned in that altered state, things experienced in the altered state, were stuck in a kind of mental cul-de-sac, which he saw as a biological cul-de-sac. There was part of the nervous system that once things fell into it, they were stuck in it. This led to his deciding to use hypnosis as a kind of forceps to enter that hypnoid state, to enter the neurological complex in which contained the hypnoid state and pull out the memories. This is how he treated Anna O, and Anna O did, in fact, get much better, although that's a long story too. Freud, on the other hand, felt that people could not remember the traumatic experiences as the heart of their hysterical symptoms because they would not psychologically. They refused to remember, that they used repression as a defense against that memory. And so he had an entirely psychological view. In many ways, the first entirely psychological view of what hysteria really was. This difference of opinion eventually caused a schism between these two old friends, such that there came a time when they would meet on the street and not even acknowledge each other's presence. They just walked past each other. Psychological trauma has existed more than likely as long as human nature has existed. And its effects have been described in literary works as early as the Mesopotamian epic Gilgamesh, which was composed in the second millennium before the Common Era. Jonathan Shea has written extensively about how post-traumatic effects are portrayed in the Iliad and the Odyssey more than 2,000 years ago. Similar observations appear about trauma in Shakespeare's Henry IV, Part 1, and Macbeth, Samuel Pepys' Diary, and a host of other fictional works. But in fact, ideas about the nature of psychological trauma have been circulating in medical conversations decades before Breuer and Freud studies were published. In 1871, cardiologist Jacob Menendez da Costa published a case study of 300 American Civil War soldiers, now veterans, which led to him describing what he called irritable heart syndrome. And he created all these tables and charts to show that Irritable heart syndrome sometimes might be attributable to swamp fever, as it was known in the Civil War, or excessive physical exertion. But in many, many of these cases, he could find no possible etiology for soldier's heart, as it came to be known, except for heavy combat. But again, DaCosta was a cardiologist, and he thought he was describing a heart disease. Of note, he had a colleague at Turner's Military Hospital in Philadelphia where he worked during the war, and that was the neurologist Silas Weir Mitchell. And Weir Mitchell interpreted pretty much the same symptoms as DaCosta described as a heart disorder as a neurological disorder. It really depends on which way you're looking at a problem. So the same symptoms are now neurological in Silas Weir Mitchell's view. And in fact, he ascribed them to physical exhaustion of the nervous system, a form of neurasthenia or weak nerves. And Weir Mitchell actually invented what we now call the rest cure to help veterans rebuild their neural vitality. His book was entitled "A Fat and Blood and How to Make Them." And the idea was that in the excessive strain of serving in the American Civil War, all of your stores, all of these veterans' stores of vitality, which were in their fat and their blood, had been drained. It was necessary to give them a very long rest in order to rebuild that. Now, a very different line of thought was brought up even a little earlier by the concept of railway spine, introduced in 1866 by the surgeon Sir John Ericsson. Ericsson was trying to explain a syndrome observed among survivors of railway disasters. Actually, Charles Dickens described this in himself. He had witnessed a railway disaster. Standing on a railway platform, the train coming to the station derailed and people were killed, and it must have been a horrible moment for him. And long after, he writes about his trembling hand and anxiety on getting anywhere near a railroad station. The symptoms of railway spine were diverse, but you probably recognize some of them. They included loss of memory, poor concentration, sleep disturbances, anxiety, irritability, headaches, back pain, and a lack of sexual desire, among others. By the way, reportedly, some of these people developed bladder dysfunction, and some apparently died of infections related to their bladder dysfunction. Now, Erickson attributed all these symptoms to concussion of the spine, which he believed was followed by chronic inflammation of the spinal cord, and again, a purely organic conception. And this organic perspective on psychological trauma, what we now consider psychological trauma, although quite honestly, going back to that list of symptoms, you have to imagine at least some of those people in those railway disasters had traumatic brain injury and actual spine injury, and maybe even severed their urethras by sudden deceleration injury, as can happen. And that's why they died of what was probably either leakage or urinary retention, peritonitis, or pyelonephritis, secondary to urethral injuries. These stories are all more complicated, and we look back in history, we're constantly rediscovering that there's usually more than one aspect of trauma, both biological and psychological. We saw a lot of this when we sort of rediscovered traumatic brain injury during our wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. But Erickson's organic perspective on psychological trauma received a huge boost during the First World War, in which over 250,000 soldiers were identified as suffering from shell shock. Now, this is a term introduced by British military psychiatrist Charles Myers back in 1915, the second year of the war in Europe, to describe what was originally believed to be a result of massive vibrations of the central nervous system caused by exploding shells, and or maybe the effect of noxious gases, not just poison gas, but fumes from exploding artillery seeping into the trenches in which the war was fought. Over time, the possibility of a psychological etiology of shell shock became widely acknowledged, in part because of the work of people like W.H. Rivers. If you've ever read the historical novel trilogy Regeneration by Pat Barker, it goes into the work of Rivers. It reconstructs part of it, but part of it's drawn directly from his scientific writings at the time in journals like The Lancet, in which he speaks about the psychological aspects of the British officers he's treating, including the war poet Wilfred Owens and Siegfried Sassoon. Also, there was the work of the American psychiatrist Thomas Salmon, who served as the first psychiatric consultant to the U.S. Army. The Army had never had a psychiatrist until Salmon stepped up to join the Army in World War I. Salmon's now remembered as the father of combat stress doctrine, a program designed to recognize combat stress in its very earliest phases, at the point at which a soldier stops playing cards with his friends, stops joking, develops a 1,000-yard stare. Combat stress doctrine was designed to recognize this, as I say, in its earliest phases and address it with rest, food, and support rather than medicalizing the problem. You know, it turned out if you medicalize shell shock, if you said, this soldier is sick and he needs to be in a hospital, and we need to withdraw him to the rear, or maybe even send him home to England or France. Shell shock was common in all the armies fighting in World War I. People didn't get better, they got worse, or they stayed the same. Many of them were invalids for years after the war, even after they were entirely safe because the war was over. They never recovered. Salmon went into the war believing he could prevent shell shock by this early recognition, and by telling people who are developing signs of combat stress that they weren't sick, they were just tired, and they needed to rest. In fact, if they were going to support their buddies at the front, they first needed to take care of themselves. Combat stress control is often summarized as a response to those early signs with great proximity, P for proximity, treat it near the front within the sound of the big guns, immediacy, do it right away, don't wait for it to get worse, and high expectation, capital E in expectation for recovery. This is known as the PI model, proximity, immediacy, expectancy. Later they added an S for simplicity. But the main point is that rather than make someone, a soldier, a patient, and no longer, and demote them from being a soldier, you say you're still a soldier, you're still in uniform, there's still duties you can perform, but you're going to get rest, usually 3 days or so. You're going to eat, and then you're going to go back to the front. A study during the Lebanon war in Israel showed that Israeli Defense Force members who were sent back to the front after 3 days of rest and food actually had better outcomes a year later than those who were sent home. Of course, there are many ways to interpret that, and one is left to wonder. And there was no guarantee they wouldn't suffer from other sequelae of psychological trauma, but they did remain in the fight, and they did function at a much higher level, did not become the invalids that they might otherwise have become. Now, by World War II, American General Omar Bradley preferred to emphasize that his men were simply tired and not sick. And this was the concept of battle fatigue. This is why we talk about battle fatigue. There wasn't going to be shell shock anymore, just tired soldiers. That war also significantly enhanced the prestige of psychiatry and psychoanalysis, because psychoanalysts, psychiatrists, Roy Grinker and John Spiegel, working with the Army Medical Corps in North Africa, we're having great success treating battle fatigue, also known as pilot fatigue in the Army Air Corps, by inducing altered mental states with either hypnosis or sodium amytal. So they were taking a page out of Charcot's book with hypnosis, but they were also using sodium amytal, which People called truth serum, they called it flax juice, they ascribed it magical properties, but all sodium amytal does is make you very, very drunk and also allow you to bring people back to sobriety very, very quickly by stopping the infusion. You have to be careful with sodium amytal. It can also stop your breathing. So we now have conscious sedation protocols, and an anesthesiologist really ought to be in attendance. But in those days, psychiatrists did this stuff. The success of their efforts is well documented in their book, Men Under Stress. I believe they had case studies of 500 World War II soldiers, airmen, and sailors and Marines. Never leave out the Marines. And there's also an Army training film, which you could watch later tonight if you can't sleep later. An Army training film called Let There Be Light, which was filmed at filmed at an Army hospital at the end of the war by the director and actor and writer John Huston, who then was with the Army Signal Corps, creating educational training films, among other things, for the military. And Let There Be Light shows real psychiatrists, real patients, real hypnosis, real amytal interviews, and shows you how in a single session, a veteran, still a service member then, who can't remember his name, another who can't walk, another who can't speak, recovers themselves to a large degree in a single treatment. It's really pretty amazing. What's also kind of interesting is that Let There Be Light was declared top secret soon after it was made. It was never allowed to be shown for 50 years, but it's now available to you on your iPhone if you care to watch it. Just Google Let There Be Light and Army training film. But I always warn people, one can become hypnotized by watching a hypnotic induction. So make a point of not being hypnotized if you can help it, and you can. So the principles described by Grinker and Spiegel were widely applied in World War II, and then again during the Korean War with impressive results. And in fact, most of the departments of psychiatry in the United States were only founded after World War II because psychiatry proved itself to be so powerful during that war. And psychoanalysis likewise gained many adherents after World War II because of Grinker and Spiegel's work. Unfortunately, these principles did not carry over to Vietnam. They were used in Korea, but not so much in Vietnam, because the military medical planners felt that it would be much more efficient to prevent combat stress than it was to treat it after it developed. So one of the key innovations during Vietnam was, rather than fighting for the duration as people did in World War II, soldiers in Vietnam, when I say soldiers, I mean all combatants. It takes a long time to get through all the kinds of combatants. Soldiers in Vietnam served 365 days, 12 months. Marines, who like to consider themselves a little tougher than other military members, served 13 months during a combat tour. But the idea was, if you knew you were getting out and you just had to make it through those 365 days or whatever the next month would be, 395 days, I suppose, then you were less likely to break down. That the idea of not having a way out except by breaking down was really what caused combat stress. But it's kind of a flawed idea, as you might find if you ever read Army Doctor Ronald Glazer's book, which was a bestseller back in the 70s, 365 Days. It describes being Glazer was, I believe, an internist, but internists had to do everything in Vietnam, including mental health. And it describes how the medical folks actually helped wounded veterans and psychologically injured veterans of Vietnam burn as many of those 365 days as possible in the hospital, so they wouldn't have to go back into combat, so they wouldn't have further breakdowns. The fact is that when service members showed signs of breakdown in Vietnam, they were less likely to be treated with 3 hots and a cot, as the combat stress control, the PIME model was known prior to that, than to be anesthetized with large doses of major tranquilizers like Thorazine. They then wake up 3 days later on a hospital ship in the Gulf of Tonkin, or maybe in a hospital in Japan. And a lot of those folks got better. I once did hear a psychiatrist who served in Vietnam explain, though, that I'll try to quote him. Uh, there are good soldiers and bad soldiers. And the way you can tell the difference between a good soldier and a bad soldier is that, and any of them can break down, good soldiers and bad soldiers both can break down in combat. But the way you tell a good soldier from a bad soldier is when they wake up 3 days later after you take the Thorazine away. The good soldier wants to go back to combat and the bad soldier doesn't. And he made this sound like a very simple and clearly true thing. It worried me a great deal. By the way, he told that story during a joint VA-DoD training of mental health professionals for the first Gulf War. And I was pretty sure we didn't want to follow that rule or take that too seriously. One way or the other, though, and this is interesting, and it's hard to say why, the overall percentage of combatants who had to be withdrawn from Vietnam for psychological reasons, purely for trauma anyway, not necessarily for substance use, which probably correlated a great deal with trauma. But the percentage of Vietnam service members who were withdrawn on medical grounds, on mental health grounds, was actually less than in previous wars. The problem is that people began to realize that when they came home, they were subject to mental health problems that nobody expected, and for which there was no diagnostic entity defined. These problems were first recognized, again, by psychoanalysts who were also psychiatrists. Chaim Shaitan and Robert J. Lifton, and I'm lucky to have gotten to know each of them. Chaim Shaitan through the International Society of Traumatic Stress Studies, and Robert J. Lifton, who was on the faculty at Yale and used to come over on Saturday mornings and lecture to anybody who'd like to talk about his experiences as a military psychiatrist and his development of theories about psychological trauma. So Shaitan and Lifton were invited by Vietnam Veterans Against the War, a group you've probably heard of. They had set up rap groups in the 70s for service members who served in Vietnam. And the idea of a rap group was that people just talk to each other and in this way support one another. It wasn't thought to be a medical intervention. In fact, they really hadn't intended medical people to be involved at all. They thought veterans could support one another and that would be fine. But when some of these veterans really became overly upset, excited, distracted during these groups, Vietnam Veterans Against the War invited these two psychiatrists to sit in on these groups and see if they could make sense of what was going on. Shaitan and Lifton, who had already been collaborating with Henry Crystal, an analyst in Detroit. Henry's son, John, is the chairman of psychiatry at Yale now. Shaitan and Lifton were influenced by Crystal's work with Holocaust survivors. And they came to recognize that in these rap groups, they were seeing an as yet undefined mental disorder among Vietnam veterans. And then the two of them worked very hard with the APA, and particularly personally with Robert Spitzer, who was developing DSM-3 at the time, to include a new diagnosis, which ultimately was post-traumatic stress disorder, and largely based on their description of these Vietnam veterans. That was 1980. And it was kind of ironic that PTSD is one of the only mental disorders defined in DSM-3, which was specifically crafted to reflect a sharp turn toward biological psychiatry. PTSD is one of the only disorders for which there is a known etiology, and the etiology is psychological trauma. Of course, as we've seen since the days of 1980 anyway, since the early 80s, the concept of PTSD has progressively shifted toward biological explanations. including the amygdala. You know, you can blame anything you want on the amygdala. It's such a neat thing to say, to conjure with. The hippocampus, you know, the hippocampus is smaller in PTSD in a number of studies, but sometimes it's the left hippocampus, sometimes it's the right, sometimes it's both, sometimes it's neither. You know, so it's kind of hard to interpret that as well. But there may be something there. A lot of people now talk about the functional relationship, which we can see in MRIs, functional MRIs, or scans between the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system, or maybe a host of physiologic changes reflected by the hypothalamic pituitary axis or other systems. So slowly since 1980, we really have drifted toward more of a biological understanding of what these symptoms are and how they come about. Although I have to tell you, I've always thought of these biological theories as the sort of wood burning theory of psychological trauma, that psychological trauma is so powerful that it literally destroys parts of your brain or disrupts them. And then you're stuck. You're just stuck the rest of your life. Something which, by the way, I don't really believe. You know, the fact is, though, there is no way to separate mind and brain. It's a mistake to try. And there certainly are many both brain and bodily correlates of psychological trauma to go along with the purely psychological elements of it. But what I want to emphasize here is the potential to be misled by ascribing all psychological trauma effects entirely to biology and physiology. There's no way to prove that there aren't psychological effects, even though for most of medical history, people kind of overlooked them. And this is where I'd like to pivot to my own personal experience with the concept of psychological trauma and PTSD. And that began when I was a psychiatry resident on my very first rotation, which was on an intermediate stay ward of the West Haven VA. Intermediate stay was a little over a year on that psychiatry ward. So things have changed since then. The long-term ward was more like 2 years. So that was July of 1980, and it was just a few weeks before the publication of DSM-3. One thing I learned from that experience is that you can publish a new version of the DSM, but if your teachers don't believe in it, you will not be expected to believe in it either. And nobody talked about PTSD for the first 4 years of my psychiatric training because my teachers did not believe in it. In fact, it was very common in those days for clinicians to tell you, I don't believe in PTSD for a variety of reasons, some entirely personal, some clinical, some political. Years later, people still were saying that PTSD was invented by left-wing psychiatrists who were trying to prove it was a bad war. And the way psychiatrists prove that a war is a bad war is by proving it causes mental illness. I once got to sit in a congressional hearing next to a fellow ex-Yale resident who was saying exactly that. Well, it made for an interesting conversation. Anyway, one of my supervisors, clinical supervisors on that ward, was a psychiatrist, Art Blank, who went on to help found the International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies. Art had been a psychiatrist in Vietnam. And Art was the person who introduced not PTSD, but the idea of Vietnam stress syndrome, which is what PTSD was often called in the very early days. People thought it was only a Vietnam disorder. It wasn't for years that people took what was then called rape trauma syndrome, or began to ask people who had served in World War II or Korea, did they have these problems? Frankly, it wasn't until the 1990s that a lot of World War II veterans began to be diagnosed with PTSD, because the idea was so entrenched this was a Vietnam syndrome. And that lost 10 good years for a lot of people and their families when they might have been getting treatment. My first job coming out of residency was at Duke and the Durham VA. And my chairman, who hired me, a very biological psychiatrist, Barney Carroll, asked me if I would ride the coattails of another fairly new psychiatrist, Jonathan Davidson, who was also working at the Durham VA, Durham, North Carolina. And Jonathan was working on a whole program of research in which he was taking biological research paradigms that had worked really well in depression, double-blind studies of antidepressants, family studies, hypothalamic pituitary axis studies, and apply them to PTSD, because PTSD had so many overlaps with major depression that maybe they were really the same thing, or maybe they were related biologically. And that isn't what I would have chosen to do, but I was very glad to. Jonathan was a wonderful researcher, a great partner, and I learned a lot working with him. And I had an open mind about what we were going to find. So over those next several years, Jonathan and I started out by validating a practical clinical interview for PTSD, one of the first clinical interviews for PTSD for research purposes, and then used them to perform randomized controlled trials of antidepressants in PTSD, and also assess various physiological aspects of PTSD, including how did they look on the dexamethasone suppression test, something our chairman Barney Carroll was using to as a biological marker for major depression. By the way, it only works in major depression when it's melancholic depression, a term that's not even in the DSM anymore, but it's an extremely severe form of depression. And even then, you're only half the time will you find abnormal results in the dexamethasone suppression study. Barney eventually bet his career that he could make DSM, I think it was DSM-3R, include the first biomarker, the DST, for depression. And when the APA said ultimately, no, we're not going to do that, but might as well flip a coin as do the dexamethasone suppression test, and it's a lot cheaper and faster. Barney basically, the wind went out of his sails, and he just no longer persisted in that direction. Really kind of sad, good, brilliant man. And it was a brilliant insight to look at that. Anyway, we looked at the DST, we looked at corticotrophin releasing hormone, noradrenergic receptors on circulating blood cells, tribulin, a biological factor that seemed to be related with excessive stress in people's blood, as well as family studies of PTSD and other mental disorders. As before we had genetic testing available. But at the same time as I was doing this biological research and learning research methodology with Jonathan, I was studying Freud in the Analytic Institute, and realizing that Freud's case studies, starting with the 4 cases Freud added to studies on hysteria, provided ways of understanding and even talking with the combat veterans of World War II and Korea and Vietnam that made up my clinic. Of roughly about 150 patients that I was following in the VA outpatient clinic. And it even helped me in my interviewing and my research work, because I had to interview a lot of people about their psychological trauma. And I could make sense of their stories from what I learned from reading Freud. And as my psychoanalytic training progressed, I came to value Freud's observations on World War I veterans and Beyond the Pleasure Principle, where he talks about a stimulus barrier and the fact that trauma might be defined as that which breaches the stimulus barrier, breaks through a protective barrier to disrupt the ego. Also, in 1920, the same year as Beyond the Pleasure Principle was published, Freud wrote what's called in the standard edition, the Memorandum on the Electrical Treatment of Soldiers. Basically, a well-known psychiatrist in Freud's circle, Werner Jahrg, had been treating shell shock with powerful, very painful electric shocks. And after the war, a group of veterans and their families filed complaints against Werner Jahrg as having abused those soldiers. The fact is that all Army medical staff used powerful, painful electric shocks to treat shell shock during World War I. There's a great book it's not a brilliant book, but it's a fascinating book to read, called The Minds and Nerves of Soldiers, by an American psychiatrist who served in World War I, who describes that, of course, there was nothing in the electricity that cured shell shock. But if you did it in a dramatic enough way, and particularly if you replaced a smaller dial on the capacitor that created the shock with a really big dial, and if possible, make it a big red dial, and put a big button on it, and said to the patient, "Oh, well, that shock didn't work, but when I turn the dial to this, it's going to work," that you could get people better. A friend of mine, Sandy McFarlane, who's an Australian psychiatrist and a history buff, once posed the question: if you were a World War I psychiatrist and you saw people truly suffering with shell shock, and you believed they were on their way to a life of invalidism, hard word to say, and you believed that you could prevent that by giving them painful, powerful shocks, would you do it? And I have to say, I long ago decided the answer for me would have been yes, I would have done that. But I'm glad I never had to. I think we have better ways now. Anyway, reading Freud and then later reading Winnicott. And you have to remember that most of Winnicott's important papers are written during and in the aftermath of World War II. Winnicott, as a pediatrician turned psychoanalyst, did more than 50 BBC broadcasts for parents of children who were living through the Blitz in World War II in England. He continued them into the 1950s. And I think that preparing those talks and thinking about what was going on in the children and in the parents and in the returning soldiers were what inspired Winnicott's ideas about transitional space and the holding environment. And for me, the idea of the holding environment, that through a steady developmental process between parent and child, a child would develop a sense of internal safety, an ability to be autonomous, an ability first to toddle away for short periods, and then establish the capacity to be alone, which they would carry throughout life. These are adventures in transitional space, as Winnicott would describe them. I've come to think of war as an assault on transitional space. And for me, Winnicott's ideas, particularly the holding environment, finally helped me understand what Freud was describing when he described the stimulus barrier. He never explained the stimulus barrier. He just provided a metaphor in which there was this thick coating around the ego that prevented anything but the most extreme stimulus of getting in. And again, if it made it through the stimulus barrier, well, that's the definition of trauma. For my part, I increasingly came to believe that the symptoms and signs of PTSD that were becoming progressively better defined in research reports and subsequent editions of the DSM could be understood in terms of massive disruption of developmental achievements, which normally would have provided lifelong stability of a person's autonomy, attachment, their capacity to be alone, frankly, their capacity to be with other people too, their sense of agency. And in terms of Erik Erikson's last phase of development, the preservation of integrity throughout life, rather than ending up in a state of despair at the end of life. That all this was made possible through a developmental process, which Winnicott, I think, described very well. And that is the way when I sit down and talk with patients who've lived through massive trauma, whether it's war or disaster or accidents or crime, I think of them in that light, that what needs to be restored is that holding environment. By the way, I don't think one can rebuild that back into what it was after it's been broken, because it does get broken. You would think it couldn't, but it can. But it's possible to reweave something new out of the shards of what's left. And this, for me, is the goal of psychotherapy and, frankly, the goal of psychopharmacology, to provide people enough breathing room, enough control over excessive anxiety to sit with their feelings and do that reweaving. Well, there was an irony in all this because as I was developing a psychoanalytic understanding, which I believe made it possible for me to be a helpful psychiatrist, psychotherapist, researcher, and even a policy maker, which culminated, as Michael said, in my 5 years as co-chair of the VA's Undersecretary for Health Special Committee on PTSD, explaining to Congress what I thought we ought to be doing. Something the VA did not thank me for in the end. It turned out the VA didn't really want to hear what I thought was wrong with them in the 60-page reports I used to write and then send to Congress every year. But I learned that lesson, and we were still able to get our point across. And later, my 4 years as chief consultant for mental health in VA central office, and to do that during a time of war, the combination of what I learned as a general psychiatrist and a psychoanalyst, I think really informed the kind of policies that I was pushing for, the kinds of treatments I thought would be helpful, and the way I continue to think about this. Interestingly, though, at the same time, psychiatry continued and continues to follow the arc of the 1990s, which were dubbed the decade of the brain, to become increasingly set on defining all mental disorders, including PTSD, in solely biological terms. We still have that split within us. What has sometimes been defined as psychiatrists being of two minds. The fact is that medical fascination with what can be observed empirically and with the process of doing research, the process itself, has created over the last 30 years a very narrow focus on what's now known as evidence-based therapies. And who could argue against evidence? This eventually got around to excluding the oldest, most widely practiced form of therapy for psychological trauma, which is psychoanalytic psychotherapy. I'm not saying everybody who's lived through trauma can or even should be placed on the couch. It's actually very hard to be on the couch after you've been through a severe trauma. Just the idea of looking over your shoulder, what's going on behind me, with a therapist, maybe more than you could handle. But the fact is that psychoanalytic psychotherapy has been excised from clinical practice guidelines. It was there in the first two editions of the International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies clinical practice guideline on PTSD, the first major one. It was there in the first two editions of the VA-DoD clinical practice guideline on PTSD. But subsequently, as new people took on the writing of the guidelines, new iterations, the ruling was, if there isn't a randomized controlled trial, and not just one, but several, and now we say without meta-analytic studies demonstrating these treatments work, you shouldn't even mention them in a clinical practice guideline. And the problem with that is, if a treatment isn't in a clinical practice guideline, it will not be taught. It will not be reimbursed. It will not be funded for research. So this is a self-fulfilling prophecy. In ongoing editions of these clinical practice guidelines, which are frankly no longer really written by clinicians, but rather by research methodologists who decide statistically whether this belongs in it or not. It is a self-fulfilling prophecy. We will not do psychoanalytic psychotherapy for psychological trauma because it's not evidence-based. There is a way out of this, and we're getting there. And maybe this conversation will help a little, and I don't know. There is, by the way, some good research evidence for psychoanalytic psychotherapy. Beyond Grinker and Spiegel, Lindy's case studies, Jacob Lindy, who just died recently, did a beautiful case series of Vietnam veterans showing the success of psychological of a psychoanalytic psychotherapy and working with them. Part of the problem with Lindy's report is that he defined aspects of success that most researchers now are not interested in, because he went beyond, well, it was before the definition in DSM-3 of PTSD. So he pointed out that their lives were better in many, many spheres. But unfortunately, very few of those ended up being symptoms of PTSD. And if you can't show in your research that you're hitting the symptoms, well, maybe you're not talking about PTSD at all. Barbara Milrod and Fred Bush in the psychoanalytic world are doing some very good research, and they are solid research methodologists. Some of it was reported last week in New York at the American Psychoanalytic meetings, that I think really stand us a chance within a few years of establishing the evidence base that will get psychoanalytic psychotherapy back into the clinical practice guidelines. But, you know, it's going to take years. And that's unfortunate, because I think a valuable resource isn't being used. Another irony is that Judith Herman's book, Trauma and Recovery, during this entire time, is probably the single most popular text among people who want to learn how to deal with psychological trauma. And that is a very psychoanalytic book. It's quite a paradox. Let me just shift to a recent experience. After I retired from the VA, I was asked to be the only psychiatrist on an ad hoc committee of the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine that was tasked to evaluate the VA's whole health program. It surprised me that my work on that committee, which led, by the way, to a publication, you can download it for free, on whole health, from the National Academies of Science, that it really came to help me see something I guess I've been working toward for the last 30 years. That as much as even I am interested in PTSD as a disorder, as a medical entity, a clinical entity, one can't really contain the idea of combat trauma in medical terms. Medical terms are not broad enough to contain it. One has to think about families. One has to think about the social determinants of health available to service members before, during, and after their combat. One has to think at the level of communities. What happens to a combat veteran when they come home to a community? Are they welcomed? Are they accepted? Are they understood? Or do they end up being marginalized? You know, the downward social drift of combat veterans is very close to that of schizophrenics. 10 years, there's a good chance they'll be on the street. They won't have a family. They may be abusing substances. That's not true by any means of all veterans. The National Vietnam Veteran Readjustment Study, published in the 1980s, the largest epidemiologic study ever done of a single mental disorder, at least up till the 1980s, showed that Vietnam veterans who went into combat, on average, made more money than Vietnam veterans who were not in combat, or people who never joined the military at all, that they achieved higher levels of education, many after they came back from Vietnam. It's not like, you know, this is the mark of Cain, you're never going to escape it. But frankly, if you don't consider the response to sending people to combat as requiring the involvement of families and social support systems, then you're never, I think, going to solve the problem of sending people to war and helping them come back as productive citizens. It just doesn't work. Many people just can't make that transition without a broader view. Whole health, by the way, has a couple of different premises that are important in this. One is that health should be defined not by what the doctor can observe or detect, but by what the patient considers to be their health values. What matters to the patient is more important than what the doctor thinks is the matter with them. The other principle is that whereas in all the healthcare systems I've ever worked in, if I'm working in the emergency room and a patient comes in 3 times that week, and I realize it's primarily because they're homeless and they're hoping to get admitted to the hospital, even though they have a mental health problem or a physical problem, um, they're primarily in the emergency room because they need a place to sleep that's safe. I've been raised in a system in which, well, that's not my job. That's really too bad, but I'm not in charge of housing. My hospital doesn't provide housing. Actually, the VA does, but most of us don't have that kind of system. But whole health says that you don't really run a healthcare system unless you include assessment and then attention to the social determinants of health, which, by the way, explain most of the variance in health outcomes of all sorts: financial, educational, vocational, nutritional, family, spiritual. These elements, if they're not attended to, are more likely to lead to permanent disorder, to disorder at all, or permanent disorder, than simply germs or the application of antibiotics. This is a view of medicine which most of us were not trained in, but it lines up so well with what I've learned watching, working with the same veterans for 30 years. They either get help in those dimensions of their lives, or they continue to go downhill. So, in retrospect, by the way, I don't think it's a coincidence that Thomas Salmon, who led the American Expeditionary Forces World War I efforts to prevent shell shock, was motivated to join the Army by his experience as the executive director of the National Committee for Mental Hygiene, which was an early 20th century public health movement in which Salmon worked for Adolf Meyer, really one of the founders of American psychiatry, William James, and a fellow named Clifford Beers, who survived his own psychotic disorder to write a best-selling book called A Mind That Found Itself, and which created the mental hygiene movement, probably the most important innovation in mental health in American history. It's probably also not a coincidence that General William Menninger, when he came home from being the senior mental health leader in World War I at a global level, went on to champion population health principles as a co-founder of the World Health Organization. Menninger argued for these principles that now we call whole health in the 1940s and 50s. Menninger also insisted that the American Psychiatric Association, despite itself, adopt the Army's diagnostic manual, which becomes DSM-1 in 1952, and ICD-6 just after, the mental health portion of ICD-6. So a final irony, and what I think is truly a return of the repressed. We're now seeing rapid movement toward the application of altered states as a treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder. The current push for psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, which is a revival of earlier experiments with psychedelics that were stopped after there were some real concerns about their safety, really brings us full circle back to the altered states of mesmerism. When Mesmer operated upon his patients magnetically, they had what he called magnetic fits. They went into altered states. Some of them became different personalities. Some just became overwhelmed with frantic behaviors and literally rolling on the floor. All sorts of very strange changes in their mentation, in their persona. On the other hand, the thing to remember as we approach psychedelic-assisted therapy is that mesmerism worked. Amytal interviews, which created altered mental states, worked. Hypnosis worked for Grinker and Spiegel. So, I'm not arguing we shouldn't do psychedelic-assisted therapy if the research shows, and right now, the research is still extremely thin. I know that people get very excited about the latest studies that are coming out. Very small n's. And all this research is being done by the same group of people, paid for by the same group of people. for the most part, maps. When one group pays for and conducts research that they believed in before they started the project, one has to at least assume the possibility of significant bias. Until these are much larger studies and replicated by people who are not invested in the outcome, even people, well-meaning people who are trying to be neutral, but are nonetheless invested in the outcome, I don't think there's grounds for approving this stuff, and I hope Congress and the FDA will agree, but we'll find out soon enough. In any case, it's interesting to me that many of the proponents of psychedelic-assisted therapy believe that psychedelics are acting on a purely biological level, that it's as if they were giving specific substances, hitting specific receptors. But in fact, all the drugs being used, many of which are not even psychedelics, from MDMA to mescaline to LSD to ketamine to psilocybin to ayahuasca, they don't have the same biological properties. They don't act on the same receptors. They're not specific biological interventions for PTSD. And we don't have a specific biological target to hit with these things, even if they were. All right, it's a mystery. We can live with mysteries. When I was in medical school, we didn't know why aspirin worked. We did not use aspirin. Now we think they work by prostaglandins. We might be surprised to find out later it isn't prostaglandins, it's something else. In any case, I just want to throw one more name at you. If you haven't read Jerome Frank's Persuasion and Healing, I really recommend that. Jerome Frank was a World War II psychiatrist who came back and didn't want to be a psychoanalyst. Jerome Frank wasn't the kind of guy I liked joining clubs. I got to meet him too, and his daughter Julia is a friend of mine, and she helped him write the last edition of Persuasion and Healing. Persuasion and Healing, instead of saying psychoanalysis rules, it says, let me look at all the forms of healing around the world in different cultures and different times. And what Frank came to his conclusion after years of doing that was that non-specific factors, including a therapeutic relationship, probably account for most of the therapeutic power of most treatments, including biological treatments, what we feel to be biological treatments. Behind me somewhere is a 2-volume set, Norcross and Lambert, on the power of therapeutic relationships. It's a mystery, and until we understand it completely, we should make pragmatic use of all the tools available to us. So in closing, it's interesting that at the start of the 21st century, we find ourselves retracing Mesmer's steps at the end of the 18th century. But then again, Francis Bacon, who died a century before Franz Anton Mesmer was even born, pointed out that unlike other scientific pursuits, medicine advances in cycles rather than straight lines. We're not like physics. We're not like chemistry. We go round and round in circles. My personal experience as a psychiatrist working in the field of PTSD really supports Bacon's statement. So in closing, I'll add my hope that by talking together about our past and keeping an open mind, being pragmatic about our present, we can do a little better job of avoiding simply going in circles in our ability to understand and alleviate disorders of traumatic stress. And I'll stop there, and we still have a little time to talk. I'm surprised nobody interrupted me, but this would be a great time to do it.
Yes, please send your questions to the chat, through the chat. As people are thinking about that, at the very end, when you were talking about the psychedelic treatment, I was talking to a group of people who were talking about ketamine, and ketamine being administered sort of in one of these, medical lab kind of places where they just people come in just for the ketamine treatment and leave, versus ketamine administered in the context of a psychotherapy relationship, or at least some effort to talk to the person about what they are looking for in the treatment, and then talk to them afterwards about what their experience was. I don't know if you have thoughts about, or any experience with those, those two different modes.
Well, those are great questions, and I know there's a hand up also. We'll get to Dr. Nielsen. I mentioned John Crystal, and John did a lot of the basic research for depression in ketamine, and also PTSD in ketamine. And John's a great scientist, and a great psychiatrist. But the protocols that Crystal researched is not what's going on in the community with ketamine. As you say, you can now get ketamine in an infusion. You can get it in a tablet. You can get it in different doses. You can microdose it. You can get it in the context of what Crystal did, which was in a certain set and setting, which made it safe and provided some guidance and support while you were having the experience with ketamine, which, by the way, ketamine's effectiveness in depression and PTSD correlates to the level of dissociation it produces. So it requires titration to get to that. But the off-label use of ketamine in every route, for every disorder, in every setting, frightens me, because when that happens with psilocybin, when that happens with LSD, when that happens with other drugs that fall within the psychedelic class, God knows what's going to happen. I don't think it's safe, and I doubt it'll be effective. But let's get to Arthur Nielsen's raised hand.
So thank you so much. What a wonderful talk. I love the history and the value of the past, looking at the past. You took me back to reading Ellenberger and Menninger and Jerome Frank, who was a teacher of mine. And just as a fun thing, Stephen King and the railway trauma. I don't know if you know, that was a big trauma in his life, that he witnessed one of his friends being killed, and then sort of a repetition compulsion, wrote about many of his books come out of that. And I wondered whether I was at Yale just before you were as a psychiatry resident in the heyday of biopsychosocial approaches. I wondered even whether you were involved with Stan Jackson, who was a historian of psychiatry.
Oh, yeah. I went
Yeah.
every other week to Stan's house for a year for his
Oh, great. Okay, so we
psychiatry.
have this in common. So I thought also of the fact that what we're calling PTSD is also the reactions to all sorts of trauma, not just war, but to being raped, to being a Holocaust survivor, to being in auto accidents, to having a kid commit suicide, all sorts of terrible things. And the research on resilience, Froma Walsh is a good friend of mine who's written about the value of community, which what you said, and the value of a holding environment. I totally, that's my experience too. But I had two questions for you, things that you didn't comment on directly, but I think the first is implied, because the issue of just reviewing events, looking at their meaning, which to me as a psychoanalyst is so critical. People have different meanings in terms of guilt, shame, survivor guilt, all sorts of feelings about what the thing meant. And I know there was some research that said almost you shouldn't do that right after events. So that's one thing. I get you to comment on that research. And the other one is EMDR, which has become this big fan favorite. So if you could talk about those, I'd love it. But thanks for the great talk again.
Oh, and thank you, and great questions. Let's see. EMDR first. I knew Francine Shapiro, and I was trained by her in what was then level 1 EMDR very early on. And when I first met Francine Shapiro, I have to tell you, I had real doubts about the theory she was offering about how eye movements by themselves would activate the brain in the same way that rapid eye movement sleep might be a brain processing process during dreams, and that metabolized memory, especially bad memories. But as I listened to Francine Shapiro, and she stood and kind of loomed over us in the class, I was struck what a powerful speaker she was, and how strong and sure of herself she was. And even though I didn't in my mind find it possible to accept the science that she was preaching as science, I couldn't help but want to believe her. And it occurred to me that this must have been what it was like to meet Anton Mesmer. I've always thought that EMDR has a bit of mesmerism in it. That said, it's yet to be proven or disproven what happens during EMDR. And one thing I really always liked about Francine Shapiro, she said, so maybe the eye movements don't really do anything. Actually, Roger Pittman did a study, a deconstruction study in which he tapped on people's knees instead of doing the eye movements. It worked just as well. Roger said that proves that eye movement desensitization reprocessing is nonsense. But the EMDR people said, oh, that proves that now we can do EMDR with the blind. So it all depends, on how you look at things, I suppose. But the idea that remembering the eye movements while being distracted allows you to actually think about what happened to you, maybe for the first time. And that thinking about it, rehearsing it in your mind may be helpful. When I was learning to be a researcher, I was told I had to go into a room with a World War II veteran, a prisoner of war, and ask them about the worst things that ever happened in their lives. And I thought, I don't know if I want to be a researcher because this is going to be very painful to my subject. Do I really want to do this to people? And I was very surprised to find over and over again, these guys would say to me, Doc, I haven't even told my own family the things I've told you today. And I also told you about what my life is like, when the kind of person I am. I have come to believe that I am a bad person. I'm mean to my kids. I drink too much. I do terrible things sometimes, and I feel terrible things sometimes. But you've just asked me a whole bunch of questions that makes it sound like you've met other people like me. I thought I was the only person like this. I feel much better now. And I just, was so pleased with one thing. It allowed me to become, I wanted to help people. And it also allowed me to feel much better about doing this kind of research. And I interviewed a lot of veterans. There is something, when Jonathan Shea wrote Achilles in Vietnam, he says that the function of the Iliad, which was originally written to be sung in public places among veterans, was to communalize the experience of having been at war. That when Sophocles, who was also a general in the Greek army in the Peloponnesian War, wrote plays like Ajax about being men at war and about the Trojan War, he was creating theater for his soldiers to attend so they could communalize with one another the experience of having been at war and the things that happen in war. I think by doing therapy with people, by creating social programs, we help people rejoin the greater community. It is a psychosocial intervention. Now, what was your first question again? I'm sorry, I lost track because I've talked too much.
You covered them both, actually, especially the personal of your own experience listening to people and having them tell you stuff they've never told anybody, and how curative that can often be. Because the question, there was some people that said, like after a big disaster like 9/11, where there were people that witnessed it and everything, they went and studied it and they said, oh no, this made people worse. But I found that hard to believe. I've never had that experience with people, that allowing them to talk about what their experience was in the personal meetings and why it was traumatic. Not that it always, made the nightmares go away, but it certainly seemed like on the way to metabolizing the trauma.
Well, whether you're Breuer and you hypnotize people and you get them to talk with you about the trauma, or whether you're Freud, asking them to associate, and which ultimately brings people back to trauma, because trauma is a powerful black hole in their mental life, and everything is drawn back to it eventually. You succeed in doing just what you're describing. In fact, all the major therapies, all the evidence-based therapies, EMDR, cognitive behavioral or cognitive processing therapy, a kind of cognitive behavioral, Prolonged exposure, even prolonged exposure, which on the surface looks like it's about habituation. If you read the rationales in the protocols that were written to train thousands of VA providers in each of these treatments, each of them say the problem with trauma is that an overwhelming experience is stuck in your brain. And either because you have cognitive stuck points that keep you from looking at it, or you have, or you're too anxious and therefore you turn away from it, and we have to habituate you to your own anxiety so you can process the trauma, finally break through to the trauma itself, or whether we do EMDR to make your brain, process the trauma. The problem is you're not processing trauma. Psychoanalysis is another way of approaching of helping stimulate the processing of trauma, but we don't make it happen. We accompany the patient as they do it, and we create a safe place where they can do it.
Okay, Karen Reitzel asks, any thoughts on how to differently address or treat intergenerational, generational trauma?
That's an area that there is. I'll put in the plug for the International Center for Multi-Generational Legacies of Trauma. It was founded by Yael Danieli, who was one of the mothers of the concept of intergenerational trauma, working with Holocaust survivors, but frankly, with survivors of trauma from all over the world. And right now, we have a whole library of webinars with survivor populations talking about intergenerational trauma. Yeah, intergenerational trauma does get passed along. As Rachel Yehuda will tell you, some of it may be passed along through epigenetic mechanisms, through things like changes in the way your genetic code is read, not changes in your code, but the way that your code is read. But it's also passed along in the way that you're raised. It's passed along in the holding environment that you internalize with parents who are unusually anxious, unusually cautious, who have certain attitudes about the world that become your attitudes. You may never know the actual story of what happened to your ancestors. They may never tell you, and most of those stories are buried, often out of the impulse to protect you, and sometimes because your grandparents, your parents don't feel they can tell you those stories. They themselves cannot tell those stories. And they haven't told them to anyone, like the combat veterans I've talked about. But whether or not you know the history, you know the response, and you carry it, and you may send it on to your children. It's very powerful. And the way to deal with it is by learning history. I'll mention my friend Hetty Fried, who survived Auschwitz, became a psychologist. Hetty was asked by the Swedish government, where she was sent after the war to recuperate and stayed on, to create a clinic, a medical clinic, a psychological clinic for Holocaust survivors, of whom there were many in Sweden, especially in Stockholm, where she lived. She reached out to her fellow survivors. She was accepted by them, but they all told her, we don't want a clinic. We don't want to see a doctor. Well, what do you want? She said. And they said, well, we'd like a place where we could meet, and somebody maybe would play the accordion, and we could celebrate the Sabbath, and maybe the rabbi would stop by, or somebody play music. And she built that. It's called Cafe 84 because it was started in 1984. But Hetty observed something really interesting. Often these older Holocaust survivors would be waiting at the door for a ride home with their children. Their adult children would come and pick them up. And once in a while, one of these adult children would show up early, and Hetty would open the door, and they would say, by the way, what is this place that my mother comes? And she would say, well, it's for Holocaust survivors. And the adult child would say, my mother's not a Holocaust survivor. She's not even Jewish. And Hetty discovered this was pretty common, actually. And then she tried to talk the parents into telling their children their Holocaust story. And the parents said, I can't tell my child that story. So Hetty, being a very creative person, said, well, what if I mixed this child with somebody else's parents? And that worked. I've had experience doing that with Vietnam veterans. Vietnam veterans unable to tell their story to their children but matching other Vietnam veterans with the children of other Vietnam veterans and seeing real success. And what the children write back is, growing up, I thought there must be something wrong with me because my parents couldn't stand me. My father could not stand me around. Every time I played in the house, he would throw me out. He would get angry. I thought I must be a terrible child. Having talked to these other Vietnam veterans, I understand that. And I understand how badly they felt when they did that to their children. And I'm going to go and talk to my parents. And if they don't want to tell me these stories, that's okay too. I get it. But at least I don't have to feel like this was my fault. And I can understand something about myself, even if it didn't cure me of the way I feel. But I see a hand raised by somebody I recognize. Rachel Kudler.
Hi. Well, thank you for the talk. It was very good. And I want to kind of start by saying, thanks to you and all the people that you worked with that defined, started the kind of defining trauma or the treatment of trauma, or basically giving it credence in general, through the path of military and veteran experiences. Because I think that just has given credence to all types of other trauma. I'm not sure if, rape survivors or child abuse survivors would be as recognized or, given uh, taken seriously, if it hadn't been for the work that you all did showing, the seriousness of the effects of trauma. So I hadn't really thought about that. So thank you for that. A big thing that comes to mind is one of my favorite things I learned about a while ago. Saul Rosenzweig being given credit for the dodo bird verdict, basically from Alice in Wonderland, which I had to look this up while you were talking, but that all psychotherapeutic techniques are equally effective in the end. And it follows the story of the dodo bird race in the movie or the book. But anyway, so just I think that it does a good job of summarizing what you're saying. Is it's really about the therapeutic relationship. That's the most important part. So and the person believing that it's really helping them, and it has to play out differently for different people at different times. And I know we're close to the end, but I was thinking of that. I was also thinking just really quickly of Buddhism, just in general, how the idea of Buddhism is accepting that life has suffering, whereas most people in our society are not raised that way. We're raised to think, oh, everything's going to be happy, and anyway. So just the idea of being able to deal with these difficulties, like you were saying, how soldiers being sent back to the front line and so forth. Well, okay, that doesn't quite connect, but basically just people accepting, suffering in general, and that might be helping with resilience. I forgot exactly what you said that brought that up. So anyway, but thank you again for a wonderful talk and all of these great ideas.
Well, thanks for bearing with me, Rachel. It's very kind of you. And one way that I think about it, I have a lot of shorthands for trauma in my head that I occasionally bring forward when I'm listening to patients. And one of them is that parents put an awful lot of energy into telling their children, things may look awful now, but it'll be better in the morning. The sun's going to rise, things are going to be fine. Just you wait. When in fact, and trauma is what happens when you live through an experience that proves that's not true. There is no guarantee the sun is going to rise in the morning. There is no guarantee things are going to be all right. In fact, things may not be good. Freud somewhere says something along the lines that the ego cannot imagine its own death, but then kind of gives credence to the idea that when faced with the imminence of death, whether or not you even get injured in the end, but faced with the realization that there is nothing preventing my death right now or some terrible outcome, that's the point of trauma. That's when not only is there a disconfirmation of this belief, and Ronnie Janoff Bullman, a cognitive psychologist, put it this way, these basic assumptions that the world is basically a good place, that other people are basically good and can be counted on, that you yourself are a good person and therefore good things will happen to you. When those assumptions are violated by a real life experience, that's what trauma is. And that's what has to be undone. And the beginning of undoing it is forming a relationship of some kind, and different people form different relationships. Some will torture you in order to work out, to express what they're going through. They can't even talk about it. They can't even think about it, but they will make you live it with them. And you will have to meet those people where they need to be met. Just as other people will talk about it abstractly and need to feel it. And other people will feel it and need to learn how to talk about it abstractly. But putting things back together again is possible. And the truth is, the world is a pretty good place, but sometimes horrifying things happen. And when they do, it isn't our personal failure. And our parents weren't trying to lie to us. They were trying to help us be the kind of people who could go out in the world and do well.
That's a very poignant note to end on. Thank you very much. This was really, as your daughter said, this was really illuminating and educational and thought-provoking. Reminds us sort of where we come from and where we're going to.
Well, you know, it's a pleasure to speak with you. I see people, Marianne Dutton just commented. Marianne is one of the first people I met in this field. Heather Craig's here, does wonderful work in trauma here in North Carolina. It's a pleasure to be a part of this, to be associated with Yellow Brick this way too. And all I can say is thank you.
Thank you. And thanks, everybody.